I'm sure that everyone's heard of the movie The Planet of the Apes. Hollywood's decided to do a couple of prequels to it of late, but that movie series is actually based on real history, based on the real world. Because when you look around you, you see that this planet is indeed dominated by the apes. Trailer apes, in this case. They've been allowed to run wild, and now they've taken over the whole planet, and they have subjugated the human beings, and all we can do at this point is try to mount a resistance, though, truth be told, some of us, rather most of us, haven't been trying very hard. Well, unless you want to wait until the trailer apes finally decide to destroy the whole planet, you better get off your butt and start making some moves. First thing that you can do is be honest about the reality that we live under, and who it is that's responsible for it. Now, there's a phrase that I created a long time ago, and I've said it many times, and I want you to memorize it, and I want you to use it whenever some pale male comes along with their pathetic attempts to try to intellectualize their garden-variety plum-dumb stupidity. The phrase that I want you to remember is racialist crackpot theories. Now, I know it's not exactly the most wieldy term, but it does encapsulate what is wrong with these clowns perfectly. It's racist, it's crackpot, and it's all a bunch of empty theorizing. None of this is actually based on fact. None of it is real. They're taking their delusions, their daydreams, their neuroses, and their insanity and claiming that apparently it's got some sort of intellectual or academic basis. That's what typifies the white males who have spent hundreds of years trying to co-opt the language of the academy in order to prop up their racism. Now, before, they based it on spiritual grounds that black people were inferior because God deemed it so. You can read it in the Bible. Then they said, well, the Negro is clearly physically challenged. When that got knocked down, they then said, well, you know, they just are. Now, if these pale males were wrong about all of their prior assertions about black inferiority, then why should anyone take them seriously now? Truth be told, no one actually takes them seriously, not even the pale males themselves. But this is the lie pulled over the world's eyes. And this brings us to Charles Murray. This clown is a so-called fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Now, you've heard me mention them before. They're one of the many white supremacist think tanks funded by the billionaire Koch brothers. And although Charles Murray has been exposed, disgraced, has been scandalized by those who have gone ahead and told the truth about him, he is still referred to in more or less positive terms by those in academic circles. They like what he stands for, though they don't want to have to stand too close to him. They get to use him as their rhetorical, philosophical crash dummy. He takes the arrows and says a lot of the garbage that they can't. Now, one of these days, I'm going to have to actually get around to doing a real video essay, though it'll probably turn out to be a series, about think tanks. I know that that's not the sexiest of subjects, and a lot of black folks would like for me to spotlight racism coming from the dominant society, but keep in mind that a large portion, in fact, the majority of racism that's generated in this society starts from the think tanks and their incestuous relationship with universities and colleges. Think tanks are so-called organizations where well-to-do white men hire pseudo-scholars like Charles Murray to come up with racist talking points that are clearly false on their face, but they get to camouflage it behind as much scientific-sounding jargon as possible. That's the reason that think tanks exist. They are there for the sake of trying to lend an air of erudition and hopefully what will sound like objective, cold clinical analysis to what are red-hot biases. Now, of course, the talking points are false, and the people who make them up, they know that they're false, but the point is to get them out there. Think tanks are effectively supposed to be a more learned, more scholarly form of propaganda. And by having an alleged academic spouting the gibberish, that's supposed to make it seem scientific and hence above reproach. This isn't racism, it's just facts. How many times have you heard that one? That's the line that the pale males love to use to defend this garbage because that's the whole point. It's the same old crap, just put into a wrapper covered with $10 words. You can find these white supremacists who work at these think tanks inventing these racialist fairy tales for that very purpose, to prop up white people's favorite gripe, their favorite whine, and they're always whining about something, but their favorite whine is, "I'm not a racist, I'm just telling the truth." Well, the only thing true is that they said it. But I'm sure you've noticed these right-wing think tanks never managed to do any kind of study or produce any books examining the racism of white America. In fact, they don't do examinations of white people, period. Never any works examining racial discrimination in schools, in the workplace, and the law. Nothing asking, what the hell's wrong with these white people? These think tanks never seem able to think about what's wrong with white people. That's never on the agenda. They have created their own bizarro land, their own alternative universe, filled with alternate facts. Alternate facts. You know, when I was growing up, alternate facts were what we used to call lies. But thanks to the think tanks who come up with all sorts of flowery-sounding words to cover up all this stuff, people are starting to forget the difference. The think tanks produce and push most of the right wingnuts that you see, especially their books. We're talking about people like Ann Coulter, Amy Chua, and of course Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein, and Heather McDonald. Let's go ahead and focus on that heifer for a while. Heather McDonald is employed by the white supremacist think tank, the Manhattan Institute, which was founded by President Reagan's former CIA director, William Casey. She wrote a fiction book called The War on Cops, and while none of it was based on facts, she did generate a particularly laughable talking point that more black males kill cops than cops kill black males. And you see this kind of hyper-distortion of statistics all the time. There's an old saying among statisticians, if you torture a statistic long enough, it will confess. And torture the stats McDonald did. Now, on its face, her little meme that she put out there about more black men kill cops than cops kill black men, that's a total lie, and McDonald herself admitted that police kill more black men than black men kill police. But then afterwards, she took the old white supremacist rhetorical trick, quote, relative to their population size. Now, armed with that particular qualification, you can pretty much twist any size population into being the majority of anything if you just torture the statistics enough, which Heather McDonald did. But even that wasn't enough to create the lie that she was so desperate to reach, so she then removed some other qualifying information, and before long she had finally invented her own convenient and totally false talking point, and claimed that she had some numbers to back it up. But of course her math, such as it was so convoluted and so complex, and the talking point itself was filled with so many qualifications that even those who quoted it kept quoting it incorrectly. This is what Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein did, by the way, with the bell curve as well. This is their standard operating procedure. They come up with a conclusion first and then try to figure out how are we going to bend and twist and break up the statistics to try to prop up some of this garbage. And these racists are always trying to make up some sort of statistic that's meant to lend an air of academic objectivity to their plainly biased racism. It's no accident that so many of these racists come from these so-called think tanks. As I've mentioned before, think tanks are also called public policy organizations. And the main thing that they concern themselves with is coming up with precisely these kind of lies to influence the public and give them to media rhetoricians and politicians so that they can push all kinds of harmful laws and social policies meant to hurt black people. These are the animals who invent the verbiage that you hear and read so often. This is what they get paid to do. These guys decided to effectively unionize themselves. That's what think tanks are. It's the racists putting together their own pseudo-academic union. And these clowns come out of the Ivy League universities. And since so many of America's business and political leaders also come from the same universities, they are able to immediately work closely together to generate the lies about the black community, then repeat the lies on media outlets that they own and control, and they get to manufacture an alleged social discourse, but one that is solely confined to the parameters of the think tank's talking points and never allowed to go outside of that. And then these white media outlets bring on the politicians and government authorities who they went to university with, and they all pretend as if this is the single most important issue ever, and they have to act on it, but always along the lines prescribed by these think tanks. So they go ahead and come up with a problem. They then define the parameters in which the discussion is going to take place, so that any solution will be exactly the one that they laid out. Nobody gets to ever interject something different. Nobody gets to challenge any of the premises that have been put forth. You just got to go along with it. This is railroading the society, and they've become experts at it. Public policy in the United States truly is the greatest show on earth. Stage managed and produced no differently than an episode of your favorite TV show. I've told you about how former Fox News chairman Roger Ailes pioneered this kind of indoctrination. I'd like to coin a new term. We've all heard of infotainment. Well, what the white media does could be more accurately described as indoctritainment. Never before has brainwashing and mind-bending been so captivating to watch. Back to Heather McDonald, though, using her book as a case study, the lying talking point that she started first got mentioned on various right-wing hate radio shows. Of course, Sean Hannity was one of them, and since he works for Fox News, it was immediately repeated there, and on a few outlets outside of the right-wing hate sphere. Eventually, it metastasized and made its way onto other platforms where you heard it being spouted by any right-winger who some TV host was dumb enough to put on their show or some radio host was dumb enough to put on the air. And of course, that was the whole point. The white supremacist think tanks come up with a meme, and then they rely on their racist rhetoricians to disseminate it and watch as it spreads like a cancer. And to an ignorant public, this lying piece of trash could be presented in a way that made her seem scholarly and even dignified. They mention that she has a degree, though they don't tell you what it's in, that she's a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Why, the Manhattan Institute? Why, that even sounds like a university, even though it's not. Most people have no idea what a think tank is. And that's part of what gives these guys cover to operate. Their safety lies in the fact that the public's totally ignorant about them. They don't know what one of these so-called institutes is. All they know is it sure sounds prestigious and official. Well, that's kind of like saying that Federal Express sounds prestigious, even though Federal Express has nothing to do with the federal government. And to many of the people, they are easily conned, or rather they con themselves into accepting liars like Heather McDonald as being experts on subjects, even though they're not sure why. They don't know why they're listening to this clown. They just know that, well, somebody said she has a degree, and she works for an institute, and she's sitting here talking about statistics, saying that she's quoting the FBI statistics. This is how these white supremacist scumbags have managed to skate by for so long. And don't count on the white left to discredit them, because the white left also has their own small army of liberal racialists who do the same thing, though they use different rhetoric. All of these guys operate out of the exact same playbook by the exact same rules, and they do it for the exact same reason. I say all that to make this point. Just as Richard Spencer didn't really know what he was talking about, neither does Charles Murray, Heather McDonald, David Horowitz, nor any of these other clowns. There's little point in actually debating them any more than there was a point in Oprah Winfrey debating the neo-Nazis. For the bad guys, the goal has always been just to publicize their putrid ideology. A lot of white people fully realize that their position in the world is based on lies, and that they have played the largest part in whatever misery they suffer. But the white supremacists depend on these useful idiots to support them. And they know that there's a ready audience of white people who are still wanting all the economic and social freebies they've always enjoyed, and who are only too willing to blame black people for white people's mistakes. And these white masses are susceptible to the white supremacist message because they have always been susceptible to it. If you haven't read Theodore Allen's seminal work, The Invention of the White Race, I would recommend it. Now, I gotta warn you in advance, it's dense reading. It's a 2-volume set, hundreds and hundreds of pages. This ain't gonna be some weekend affair. But it's a white man who is honestly discussing and dissecting the history of the white race and how white people use made-up lies about race, class, etc. in order to sucker white people into continually fighting against their own best interests. He lays bare the historical examples and machinery of how white people have always tried to pit one person against the other for the sake of protecting white supremacy, even before it had the name. And the carrot that is used isn't so much money or social issues, rather it is to psychologically masturbate the white public, tell them that they're better than fill in the blank. As Friedrich Nietzsche wrote in his seminal work, Beyond Good and Evil, the power of the ruling class has always been more psychological than physical, and indeed he was right. And the same principle goes for Charles Murray's crap. The numbers of black students in universities is low, and it hasn't really moved in decades, so what sane person, and even a white person, would write about black people in the universities being there when they are in fact a virtual non-entity? Even if black people voluntarily stopped applying to colleges tomorrow morning, then you would simply make more room for Asians by default. Even white people have had to admit that affirmative action has helped to stop Asian students from wholesale taking over the universities. That affirmative action has been one of the few saving graces for white people to actually be able to go to school and not be run out by the Asians. At least on the coasts, they're willing to admit to that. It's out in flyover country, backward backwaters like Texas and Michigan, where you find the white people trying to figure out how to fight reality. So why are these clowns always whining about black people in the first place? Because it's not about how many white kids are able to get into this or that college. It's not about how many black people are in jail. It's not about crime. In fact, it's not about the statistics. This is about justifying a degenerate, perverted social order and all the things that white people do in order to maintain that social order. And to prop up a lie that big, you don't just need one lie or even a page of lies. You need an entire book full of lies, hundreds of pages, a library full of lies. In fact, you need a small army of liars and rhetoricians to pump out the propaganda. Tell the lies and tell them big. Tell them all the time so that it will be hard to believe them and even harder to refute them. Now, if the work of these right-wing white supremacists like Charles Murray was really so academically solid, then why is it that there isn't some flood of other white academics eager to examine and adopt their nonsense? Sure, they'll have some white people who are just bold enough, have just enough nerve to invite Charles Murray to speak at a university. But you don't see anyone actually endorsing his crap. Why? It's because they don't want to look as stupid as Charles Murray does. They understand that he's nothing but a white supremacist rhetorician. They want to make sure that he keeps the hate out there, but they also understand that what he's saying is, of course, demonstrably false. And none of them are actually going to try to put their own reputations on the line to protect what they all recognize to be a lie. Charles Murray is no academic. He never has been. He's a white supremacist half-wit who whores his degrees as a means of getting money from rich white men who are as racist and intellectually bankrupt as he is. Charles Murray is not an evolutionary biologist. He's not a sociologist. He's not an anthropologist. He's not a geneticist. He's not even an educator. So when he tries to put forward the idea that black people are just genetically inferior, due strictly to race and nothing else, Charles Murray's degrees are in history and political science, so he has no basis upon which to speak. He's not an expert on any facet that he would need in order to speak on the subject, and yet he is treated as if he were. Now, what on earth does history have to do with examining genes, or political science for that matter? He got some do-nothing degrees, and then he conveniently neglects to tell anyone that he may have a PhD, but it has nothing to do with race or genetics. You know, it reminds me of when Dr. Francis Cress Welsing debated that William Shockley clown back in the 70s. Like most white men, Shockley figured everything he said was cute, so he decided that without anything even remotely resembling qualifications, he would call himself declaring that black people are genetically inferior to whites. Again, William Shockley wasn't a geneticist nor a biologist. He was a physicist. Now, what on earth does physics have to do with understanding genetics? Nothing. This is the sewer of entitlement that creeps like Murray and Shockley crawled out of. Who in their right minds would take them seriously on anything involving race? Just because someone has a PhD in history, does that make them qualified to be a physicist? Would the late Dr. Shockley think that his degree in physics would make him qualified to be a historian? But of course, the reason these white men get to give their ignorant opinions is because we live under white supremacy. And their qualification to speak isn't based on their academics nor on their research. They're white men. That is what qualifies them as authorities on any and all subjects, especially black people. Now, this is the kind of behavior that would get a black person, or any non-white person for that matter, laughed out of the room. You would have the media ridiculing any black person who attempted this. But for a white person, they get invited on TV and no one ever questions their total lack of qualifications. It's never even brought up. They're white, hence everything they say is to be taken seriously. Now, of course, we won't get into the fact that Charles Murray is himself of Irish descent, and he ought to know better than anyone how the British pushed the idea of Irish intellectual inferiority. In fact, that's where the whites in the United States got the idea from. Please take a chance, if you get the opportunity, to read Theodore Allen's book. The first book, Volume 1, deals specifically with the oppression of the Irish by the Anglo-Saxons, and how so much of what was going on in Ireland over the 700 years of British occupation was taken by those same Anglo-Saxons to the Americas, because after all, Ireland was just a pit stop on the way to the so-called New World, so it made sense. You basically had a transatlantic corridor for Anglo-Saxon idiocy. Irish are Caucasians who have been the most discriminated against, particularly the Irish, who are also the most racist. We can reasonably assume what their motivations are. Now, William Shockley had the convenient cover of being able to declare black genetic inferiority without danger that he could ever be proven wrong. After all, the decoding of the human genome was still over 25 years away when he lost that debate to Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. Whenever some white supremacist trots out the old saw about black people are genetically inferior, what you should do is to immediately demand that they point out the specific gene that is responsible for this alleged racial inferiority. The human genome has been mapped, people. If anyone tries to claim that this or that thing is somehow genetic in nature, whether it's black inferiority or homosexuality, the first thing you should do is point at the human genome and say, well, we've got all the genes mapped. Go ahead and show me the one that's responsible for it. Or show me the gene that black people lack, which apparently is responsible for all of this alleged black inferiority. They want to claim that it's on the basis of genetics? Challenge them on that. Force them to prove the crap that they say. You're all familiar with the made-for-TV movie The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. If black people are so clearly genetically inferior to whites, then why did white geneticists decide to make this black woman their standard for stem cell research? and not one of them objected to using a black woman's DNA on the grounds that her genetics were inferior to whites. Quite the opposite. These white geneticists have gone to the mat, not only to benefit financially from this black woman's genes, but to make sure that the research they develop from it remains proprietary and out of the public domain. Charles Murray's cheap brand of racism is the same old pack of lies. He tries to keep the language just vague enough that he thinks he's given himself rhetorical wiggle room to deny being a racist, but since his audience is white people, he of course at some point has to make it clear to them that this is totally about race. It's a tightrope to walk on, but it becomes a lot easier when you consider that there is a white media that is not going to question him on anything he says, and indeed will take his part in any and all debates. Charles Murray, by the way, is still trying to peddle his racialist crackpot theories, and he's angry that people are still calling him out on it. He's been trying to live down the infamy that he and Richard Herrnstein rightfully received in the 1990s after the bell curve was published, though in truth he hasn't been trying too hard. And it frustrated him and his fellow travelers that his opponents are still handcuffing him to his racism. He is seen as a white supremacist, not an academic, no matter the white media's pathetic attempts to clean up his racism and try to upgrade him to being controversial or whatever. They can't keep the stench of white supremacy off of him. Charles Murray is the same as every other white supremacist. They focus solely on black people, exclude white people from any and all comparative analysis, as I've shown with my white-on-white crime series. The injustice system is set up to put black people in prison whether they committed the crime or not, and to exclude all white people from punishment no matter what they've done. Racialist crackpot theories aren't meant to convince or persuade. Nobody, and I mean no freaking body, has ever said the words, "You know, I used to think that black people in America were the smartest kids in class until I read Charles Murray's book." These people were already racist long before Charles Murray came along. The only reason that they like Charles Murray is because they feel that he can provide them with complex words behind which they can hide, because racists are always trying to find a way to rationalize the irrational ideology of white supremacy. And that's where Charles Murray comes in. Because if they didn't need Charles Murray, then why is it that they couldn't come up with this on their own? See, black people were able to lay the foundations of our own intellectual beliefs. You find several centers of African thought, but with white supremacy, it's all centralized from the top down. They're taking their marching orders directly from the white elites, and they like it that way. And it's not just the rank and file white person on the street who's getting their garbage from Fox News. The white media, the propaganda arm of white supremacy, indoctrinates people against the black community from day one. If it's not TV and movies, it's children's books or the nightly news. People don't have to wait until some rabid racist comes up to them and starts saying, "We need to be able to call black people less than human." Anti-black racism is the mother's milk of the white media, and it is pumped out 24/7. People are taught all the stereotypes and tropes and white supremacist beliefs by the white media. The only difference is the white media doesn't slap a white supremacist brand name on their filth like Stormfront or the White Aryan Resistance does. I've always told you that white supremacy is the opposite of justice, and it's also the opposite of intelligence. They take some pre-canned talking points, which have usually been truncated, edited, and twisted beyond all recognition, and then call these their facts. But these are the voices white people are listening to, because these liars and perverts tell the white public what they want to hear. That the most powerless people in the society are somehow responsible for what happens to the most powerful people in the society. That the same people who whites daily excoriate as being hopeless failures on all front somehow are able to control the lives of the most successful, brilliant white folks. And not once do white people have to ever confront the ugly truth that white people are in fact the cause of all their own troubles and of a lot of non-white people's troubles. No one else has the power to trouble white people, certainly not black folks. But white people have been on a 500-year-long vacation from reality, and with the help of liars like Charles Murray, they hope to extend their vacation into perpetuity. So no matter how false Charles Murray's lies are proven to be, no matter how much he himself has to backtrack on them, white people will still cling to his lies like a life preserver, because to them, that's what Murray's propaganda is. It's an island of fiction and feel-good lies, meant to protect white people from the cold, hard facts. And they can continue to embrace these lies, but reality has a funny way of always having the last word. And when that last word is spoken, you can bet that it will come from a black man's voice. And after that, there won't be any more debate.